to start. What's up, YouTube? Welcome to the channel. I'm Charlotte, I'm a performance nutritionist. This is hard. Bringing together research, everyday, practical advice, and meshing the two together and making it easy to understand. Research is really hard to read and really hard to understand, and one of the bane of my life, one of the banes of my life, the bane of my life, not the bane of my life, like there are bigger banes of my life, is reading research and then having to dissect it all. So I'm going to do that for you, because reading research and being faced with like all these statistics and you're like, which bits are relevant, what does it actually mean? So we're going to try and answer the question, what is this research and what does it actually mean for the practical application, for the work with my clients? And this is what I do when I apply stuff to my clients. I look at the research behind it, I look at the practical application, and I kind of smush the two together and we find a best case scenario that kind of works for those clients. So let's get into it.
We are going. So this is a really new paper. So this is the first research review we're doing, and decided just to go with a new paper, and we're starting with a meta-analysis, systematic review. So does adaptive thermogenesis occur after weight loss in adults? Systematic review by Niers et al. 2021, so published this year. And this is published in the British Journal of Nutrition. This is basically, does metabolism slow down after weight loss in adults? This is taken, a systematic review means it's taken a collection of studies and looked at them to see what happens. Essentially, that's pretty much all it is. So to give a bit of background to this paper, like, what is energy balance? And energy balance is this really simple mathematical concept. So we have energy in and energy out. And the kind of idea is that if you want to lose weight, you need to be in a calorie deficit. So we need to expend more energy than we put in. So the energy out has to be bigger than the energy in. So we need to take in 2,000 calories and burn 2,500. Boom, jobs are good one. But in reality, it doesn't work like that, because it is extremely complex in practice, because we have trouble with things like food labeling being slightly inaccurate and it being extremely easy to mistrack food. So we don't track accurately. Even like dietitians and nutritionists do not track accurately, and it is very difficult trying to account for absolutely everything, trying to weigh it properly. Yeah, it just doesn't work that well. And also because the energy out component changes so much on a day-to-day basis, depending on what you're doing, depending on what your lifestyle's like. So neither of those parts are static, which makes it extremely difficult. It's a dynamic equation. So a little screenshot from the paper there. It's a dynamic system in which components, i.e. the energy intake and the energy expenditure, fluctuate over time and change in response to perturbations in either side of the equation. And this is a really important bit. And this essentially just means, I need to start saying essentially, I told myself I wouldn't, and I'm already doing it. And this means that changes in energy intake will affect energy expenditure, and changes in energy expenditure will affect energy intake. So it's like a two-sided equation. It's a double-edged sword, and we haven't quite figured out how to make that work together yet. So yes, it does change a lot, and both sides of the equation influence each other. And what is adaptive thermogenesis? Why is it interesting? So adaptive thermogenesis is the changes in essentially like energy metabolism, not even changes in energy metabolism, but changes in energy expenditure, how much energy we burn during the course of the day. And it's interesting because we don't have trouble losing weight, we have trouble keeping it off. And there's been this kind of thinking that this is because metabolism adapts and metabolism is downregulated and metabolism stays downregulated. So the kind of general idea, especially within the fitness industry, is that you diet, your metabolism slows down and you burn less calories during the day, which makes it harder to stay at your lower weight. And to some extent, that does happen. So we want to know, is adaptive thermogenesis to blame with our struggles with weight regain? So is it because we burn less calories over the course of the day that we actually put weight back on, or is it something else? And can we mitigate adaptive thermogenesis? Can we actually stop it from happening at all? So adaptive thermogenesis is the reduction in metabolism after weight loss. And we generally do, like, this is a thing. You may have heard of it called starvation mode. However, it doesn't quite occur in the way that you probably think it does, or for the reasons you probably think it does. And some reduction is normal. So a smaller human being needs less energy to sustain. So smaller people will generally just burn more calories, but burn fewer calories over the course of the day. And bigger people generally burn more calories over the course of the day. And adaptive thermogenesis is the reduction beyond what we would expect based on the weight you've lost. So if you have two people who weigh 70 kilos, but this person reached 70 kilos after coming down from 90 kilos, their metabolism would probably be lower, or the number of calories they burn during the day will probably be lower than a person who has always been 70 kilos. And this is kind of the issue that we're facing. Like, to what extent does adaptive thermogenesis actually happen, and how much does it impact our energy burn during the day? It's a protective mechanism. So it is designed to stop us from starving to death effectively. So our body becomes way less wasteful with energy. So we become better at preserving energy, better at using the energy that we've got. And our body doesn't know that we're trying to just look good in a bikini for summer. It thinks that we're going to starve to death. So it puts things in place to prevent us from burning as many calories, to try and protect us as much as possible, because our body likes to defend our highest body weight. So with this paper, the inclusion criteria was producing clinically meaningful weight loss. And this is important because you will see studies where they go, oh, no adaptive thermogenesis took place, but they also didn't get any clinically meaningful weight loss. So clinically meaningful weight loss is generally about 5 to 10% of body weight or higher. It included 33 studies, which is a decent number of studies. Only 7 of these studies looked at total daily energy expenditure. So the rest of the studies looked at basal metabolic rate, which is the amount of energy that you would burn if you just laid still and breathed all day and did absolutely nothing else. And only 7 studies looked at your total energy expenditure over the course of the day, that's probably because it's quite difficult to measure. And the dietary intervention, there was a big spread of different diet methodologies. I probably should say at this point that not all of the interventions used diet as an intervention. They were separated into 3 categories. So some used diet and exercise, and some used exercise only. But the dietary interventions were wide ranging. So we had very low calorie diets, low calorie diets, diets that were a proportion of someone's predicted daily energy expenditure, high protein diets, ketogenic diets, swapping around the carbon fat content and the carbon fat ratio. So a huge spread of different methodologies that you would expect to see if someone was trying to lose weight. So what actually happened with adaptive thermogenesis, like with these groups of people that were tested, what happened? So in the diet only groups, only 3 studies didn't report significant adaptive thermogenesis, which means that the rest of the studies saw some level of adaptive thermogenesis. I think there were about 9 or 10 studies that did a diet only approach. So one study that didn't show adaptive thermogenesis, and this is interesting, was in a group of intermittent energy restriction versus continuous energy restriction. So that means the intermittent energy restriction dieted for a period of time, then came back to maintenance, then dieted for a period of time, then came back to maintenance for a little bit, or dieted for a bit and then didn't consciously try and diet for a bit. So they might not have been at weight maintenance. They might have just been eating ad libitum. I think in this study, they just ate ad libitum versus continuous dieting. So a continuous restriction of energy without those periods of increasing energy intake. So intermittent energy restriction didn't show adaptive thermogenesis despite significantly greater weight loss. So despite having large amounts of weight loss, they didn't show adaptive thermogenesis, which is very interesting, which suggests that intermittent energy restriction might actually be very helpful within the context of losing weight and keeping it off. But there are also differences in methodology, and how you measure this matters. So I'm not going to go into the methodology of measuring BMR because the whole point of this is to keep it simple, and that's very simple. But one of the difficult things about measuring metabolism and measuring things like that, and then comparing those studies to each other, is that they all use different methodologies and they all use different methods of measuring. So yeah, that's something just to bear in mind with looking at studies, is that sometimes measurement methods are not sensitive enough to pick up on small changes in adaptive thermogenesis. So a follow-up period seemed to show that adaptive thermogenesis disappeared shortly after a period of weight maintenance, and this was fairly consistent over the studies. So once you go back to your normal diet, to maintenance, to even if body weight, the weight loss is sustained and is maintained, the adaptive thermogenesis seems to disappear, but you might have it lasting for a little while, and the follow-ups were generally about 6 to 12 months. So the exercise or diet and exercise in combination things, the diet and exercises lost a lot of body weight. Exercise only didn't really show much body weight loss, and this has been shown previously in research that an exercise intervention without a dietary intervention doesn't tend to be that successful, but when you combine diet and exercise together, it tends to be the most successful of all interventions. So most of them showed adaptive thermogenesis, and the only ones that didn't show adaptive thermogenesis was when they only lost small amounts of weight, so between about 1 and 4 kilos, which probably wasn't clinically meaningful. The study didn't mention it, but it probably wasn't meaningful at all. And one study reported attenuated adaptive thermogenesis, so it had gone after a 1 to 2 year follow-up. And the greater the weight loss, the more adaptive thermogenesis we seem to see. So it seems to be quite proportional. So the more weight you lose, the more your metabolism might be reduced at the end of it. So the values for adaptive thermogenesis range between kilojoules, except for 2 studies. These studies reported significant weight loss and showed large adaptive thermogenesis, which increased during the follow-up. So I think this was actually the biggest loser study that we're talking about, but we'll come back to that. Yes, we'll chat about that in more detail soon. So the third method of weight loss that they use was bariatric surgery, and they showed that a significant value for adaptive thermogenesis reported in 4 of the 6 studies. So interestingly, the type of bariatric surgery that you have seems to change the level of adaptive thermogenesis that you get. So gastric banding didn't report significant values for adaptive thermogenesis. However, it was reported for most participants using other surgeries. And this adaptive thermogenesis, again, reduced over time. So came back up to normal, your metabolism came back to expected or predicted over time. And yeah, gastric banding doesn't seem to have much of an effect. And that could be due to the actual method of the weight loss surgery, because with gastric banding, we don't bypass any of the stomach, so it probably won't change the hormonal response. We simply band the stomach, put like an elastic band around it, which means that it feels fuller sooner, so it doesn't change the hormonal profile that as it might change when you are actually like taking out a bit of the stomach. So the effect of weight loss on total daily energy expenditure, in these little bits, they measured predicted total daily energy expenditure versus measured total daily energy expenditure. And one of the issues with this is that we have to rely on those predictive equations being correct for that individual. And they did do things to standardize them, but it's just something to bear in mind, is that we do have to rely on those predictive equations being representative of the sample that we've got. And also, when we're measuring total daily energy expenditure, a metabolic chamber is not a free living situation. So if you have someone who's sat in a room having their gas exchange measured constantly, it's not a free living situation. So we don't know how this actually impacts in the real world. So it's just something to think about. Doubly labeled water is probably a more accurate representation, which is another laboratory technique that we use to measure energy expenditure. And most studies found adaptive thermogenesis, but the follow-up period showed that this reduced over time, as with all the things. So I think generally the thing to take away from this is that, yes, your metabolism might slow down a little bit immediately as you're dieting and immediately after your diet, but then this kind of goes away. So what actually causes adaptive thermogenesis? And we're still not entirely sure, but we think it's something to do with losses in fat mass and fat-free mass, hormonal changes, and changes in sympathetic nervous system activity. So the role of hormones in adaptive thermogenesis is very much still up for debate. So we can't simply give someone hormone replacement therapy and go, oh, this will get rid of the adaptive thermogenesis. We don't really know. But it seems to be some product of being in an energy deficit that causes our bodies to kind of freak out a little bit and go, actually, we don't like this. We need to protect ourselves. Let's expend less energy. So does how we lose weight matter? Based on all of the information in that systematic review, gastric banding seems to produce less or no adaptive thermogenesis, but also produces comparatively lower weight loss. And this is important to note if you are someone who's looking into bariatric surgery. It seems to produce much less weight loss in the grand scheme of things. So as I mentioned earlier, the gastric banding process producing less adaptive thermogenesis could be due to the procedure itself. So changing, actually removing part of the stomach as you would do in a bypass or a gastrectomy, that's the word, removes part of the stomach, which will change the hormonal response to it. And this study also, once again, as has been highlighted in the research quite a lot, showed the ineffectiveness of exercise-only interventions. They didn't report adaptive thermogenesis because they didn't show any significant weight loss. So yeah, so we're just going to quickly touch on the Biggest Loser study, which is one of the studies that was included in this systematic review. So the Biggest Loser study is a study of Biggest Loser contestants, and it's a very interesting study because it's one of the few studies that actually shows that adaptive thermogenesis might hang around for quite a long time in a long follow-up period, because they did a very long follow-up period with these contestants. So it was a lifestyle intervention, diet and exercise. If you've watched the show The Biggest Loser, you will have seen this. They basically like go live in a house and eat food and exercise a lot. And adaptive thermogenesis seemed to persist even after the follow-up period, which was a couple of, 6 years, which is a lot. Adaptive thermogenesis not only remained present, but also increased their value after 6 years. However, as some of the participants lost weight on the 2 weeks prior to the 6-year follow-up measurement, the 6-year follow-up measurements, the state of energy balance could have influenced the assessment of adaptive thermogenesis. So the Biggest Loser contestants may have screwed slightly with these results because they tried to diet for 2 weeks or for a few weeks prior to this 6-year follow-up period to make it look like they had, lost more weight or maintained their weight loss better. So they kind of dropped back into a calorie deficit, and that might affect the readings of adaptive thermogenesis. And we simply don't know yet because we haven't found a situation where we can measure this well. Without people, we can't lock people in a room for 6 years and follow them. We haven't found a free living situation where we can actually manage this well. And I think one of the keys here is free living situations, and people will do different things. So does how much weight we lose matter? There seems to be a correlation, but there's also been some conflicting results. So the more weight you lose, it looks like the more adaptive thermogenesis you get. But again, there are always been some studies that kind of go against this. Yes, and energy balance might impact adaptive thermogenesis. So the energy balance or the energy state that you're in at the time of measurement might impact measures of adaptive thermogenesis. So we need to see if we're measuring during periods of weight loss or measuring during periods of weight stability. So the Biggest Loser contestants were not measured during periods of weight stability, they were measured during periods of weight loss, and that might have influenced the results of adaptive thermogenesis. So weight stable participants seem to demonstrate lower metabolic adaptation at the point of measurement. So if your weight is not changing, staying around about the same, seems to show that you don't have as much adaptive thermogenesis or metabolic adaptation. And as with all studies, there are issues with methods. So the use of predictive equations, I mentioned this earlier, we don't know if those predictions are correct or relevant for that person and for that individual. We can kind of have a look at this and standardize it a little bit by measuring before an intervention. So measuring resting energy expenditure before an intervention and comparing that to predicted resting energy expenditure, doing the intervention and then measuring it again. But in studies where that didn't happen, we have to rely on the predictive equations being correct. Inaccuracies of measuring body composition. The inaccuracies of measuring body composition are very well reported. We know that a lot of studies used various methods. So it's called the 4-compartment model. So they used a few different methods of doing it. So things like DEXA scanning and stuff like that. To have a look at body composition and to see what was going on there. But if you didn't use particularly accurate measures of body composition, we might not have got very accurate results. Hydration and glycogen status of lean muscle will impact readings that we get. And very interestingly, MRI seems to be super accurate at measuring adaptive thermogenesis, but also demonstrated no or very little adaptive thermogenesis after measurement. And this is because it's very sensitive to the metabolic activity of the different tissues itself. So it can identify what is muscle and see what's going on at a metabolic level there, and identify what is adipose tissue and see what's going on at a metabolic level there. So very interestingly, probably the most accurate way of measuring adaptive thermogenesis showed that there was little to no adaptive thermogenesis after weight loss. So that kind of throws things up in the air again, and we still don't seem to really know. So yeah, studies that assessed AT using MRI showed reported lower or non-significant values for AT. This could be due to the ability to accurately assess tissue organ components without relying on assumptions, also allowing to account for the specific metabolic rates associated to each tissue. So we can see how with changes in lean mass and fat mass, adaptive thermogenesis might change, or metabolism itself might change slightly. And then the final take homes, like, what does this all actually mean for us as practitioners when we're working with clients, for you if you're on a weight loss journey? And it seems that the well-designed studies, or the better designed studies, demonstrated less or no adaptive thermogenesis in terms of resting energy expenditure. So this is kind of pretty much just looking at BMR, so your basal metabolic rate, the amount of energy that you will use while you just lie and breathe. And we still don't really know to what extent adaptive thermogenesis occurs. Even though it's been studied quite a lot, we're still not really sure. So it does warrant further investigation, further explanation. So yeah. Oh, should have got a drink. And this is pretty much the conclusion to most papers. More high quality studies are warranted, not only to disclose the existence of adaptive thermogenesis, but to understand the clinical implications on weight management outcomes. Yeah, we still aren't really sure. We have no definite conclusions from this paper. So other research is also very interesting into the adaptive thermogenesis arena. So this paper by Rosenbaum and LEIBEL, I don't know how to pronounce that name, in 2010 showed that 10% weight loss maintained sees a 20 to 25% reduction in 24-hour energy expenditure versus what we would expect. And this is interesting because this is 24-hour energy expenditure. So this is your daily energy expenditure, not just your BMR. And it suggested that the reduced obese will need about 300 to 400 calories less than someone of the same weight who has never been obese. So this is probably showing how our bodies actually become very efficient with movement and with movement and with energy expenditure beyond just our BMR. So yes, interesting to see. So non-resting energy expenditure seems to be the most effective compartment of energy expenditure. So when I say non-resting, anything that is moving about, getting up, walking around, exercising, eat, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, that kind of thing, that all seems to be a very key player in maintaining weight loss in the long term. And then the real world application, BMR is just one component of energy expenditure, and it's probably the one that we should probably stress about the least because we have not that much control over it at all. And worrying about the impact of dieting on BMR is quite a futile exercise. We know that from most of the studies that adaptive thermogenesis does just disappear over time, apart from that one Biggest Loser study, which there are issues with the methodology. We know that it either doesn't happen, happens to a little small extent, or doesn't happen at all, or disappears after time. So control what you can actually control. So whether this is you looking at weight loss yourself or you looking at weight loss with your clients, control what you can control, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is how much you move around during the day, and exercise activity thermogenesis, which will probably contribute a lower energy expenditure than NEAT, but will still contribute to total energy expenditure during the day. So keeping total energy expenditure high is important because as we diet, we tend to move around less because we have less energy to do so. So being in a calorie deficit will probably make us a little bit more lethargic, a little bit more sluggish, a little bit more slow, and a little bit less inclined to move around to exercise. So setting things like step goals and exercise goals and movement goals can help to keep that energy expenditure high. And we don't mean to do this. We just kind of do it by accident. It's very subconscious, and it's just our body's way of preserving energy. And then probably spend as little time in a deficit as possible. And this is where a bit of rapid fat loss might come in handy. So try not to be one of those people that's been dieting for the last 10 years if you can be. So not dieting is probably the best way to make sure your metabolism's fine and good to go and you don't suffer with adaptive thermogenesis. So while it's total weight loss that will potentially lead to adaptive thermogenesis and is the key player in metabolic adaptation, not how long you spend in a deficit. The less time you spend in a deficit and the faster you get to that goal weight and that total amount of weight loss, the sooner you can come back to maintenance, and that allows you to come back to probably building muscle more effectively, increasing NEAT, increasing exercise activity thermogenesis, and just generally having like a better time. And also getting rid of any adaptive thermogenesis that has occurred. So there may also be a case for intermittent energy restriction, as you mentioned earlier, and for rapid fat loss, as I just spoke about. And weight cycling might not be a good idea, but again, we don't particularly know the impact of this yet. Maybe that'll be another video. We'll have a look at research around weight cycling. And weight cycling is essentially like losing weight and then gaining it back again and then losing it again and then yo-yo dieting effectively. We don't know what effect that has on metabolic rate, on adaptive thermogenesis, or metabolic adaptation. So try to avoid weight cycling if you can. And to maintain weight loss, it might take more of a conscious effort to maintain your energy expenditure because you're probably going to be feeling a bit more tired and a bit more lethargic. When people go, oh, my metabolism's crashed, it generally means I'm moving around a lot less than I used to because I'm tired and I have no energy because I'm trying to diet. So take from that what you will. And thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.